Alright folks, North America, part 2. Again, just like previous practice, we're going to focus more on the human dimensions of things. So we're going to begin with globalization and development from the perspective of North America, being the United States and Canada. So by the 1960s, manufacturing begins to slow and it begins to shift. And we ask why. Well, why? I'll tell you why. Because wages. And wages are going to draw this because those that were demanding higher wages were often a unionized workforce, and that of the Northeast was formerly in the Mid-Atlantic states, the old economic core, as the book would call it, did have an advanced workforce in this sense in terms of unionization, and that drove the industry to the American Southeast. And from there, just like anything, it catches up with them, and those jobs eventually were moved to Mexico and other places around the world and abroad in search of lower wages, because the lower wages increases the profits that these companies can incur. So we will now face some boarded up and broken glass buildings around the country because the steel mills, in this example, this is a former steel mill, and other manufacturing endeavors have just begun to cease and die off, not everywhere, but to a large extent because of our advanced workforce in this country. We have high educational attainment in relation to other countries. We have a lot of unions, and these are good things because they ensure benefits and they ensure or intend to ensure livable wages. But that does come at a detriment when companies are only looking at bottom lines and needing to make money. And one example in the steel mill is that back at this point in time, it would take 10 man-hours and $1,000 for 1 ton of steel to be produced. Because of automation and through time, that was cut down to 1.9 man-hours and $200 per ton of steel. So you can see why it just didn't make sense, economically speaking, for these industries to continue in their current practices back then. Now, as of 2016, 80% of the jobs in the United States and Canada have moved to that tertiary sector, the service sector economy. Now, globalization and free trade. We talked about free trade before in our introduction, that free trade is really an ideal because there will always be some level of tariffs and trade restrictions, so we can have freer trade, but unlikely ever free trade. The United States and Canada play a major a role in globalization around the world. It's not difficult to move around the world and find an American brand somewhere. And NAFTA is one free trade agreement that we cite because this does take up 2 out of the 3 countries. There were going to be 2 of the 3 countries in North America in the geographic sense, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, but for our intent of this book, just the United States and Canada. Now, this was an agreement that started in 1989 between the United States and Canada, and in 1994, Mexico comes on board to make this the North American Free Trade Agreement. Now, as a result, this inclusion with Mexico, the United States incurred a trade deficit with Mexico, whereas before the effects of NAFTA, the United States in trading with Mexico was to the tune of a positive $1 billion, and now they have a trade deficit of roughly, a deficit meaning a negative of $57 billion in terms of that economic relationship now. So you can see that it has had certain effects on the American economy. Chicken cars and call centers. What do these all have in common? Well, I'll tell you in just a moment. Now, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, probably you've heard of this, originally called the P4 in 2005, but in 2008 it extended and expanded to 12 negotiators, one being that of the United States, became a major issue in the 2016 presidential campaign, where again it was endorsed by President Obama and was once referred to by one of the candidates, Hillary Clinton, as the gold standard for trade deals. Later walked back that comment because a more populist message came from that of Bernie Sanders, Senator Bernie Sanders, and Donald Trump, who pushed back and did not like the trade agreement. So, keeping one of his words, we removed ourselves from the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2017, and they had been faced to reorganize. Their name now is the Comprehensive Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. If you can keep up with that, good for you. But what the endeavors is with global trade, like anything, is to get involved with these domestic markets. Now, if you know about Asia, China is one of the world's largest countries. In China and in India, among the world's largest, and the American companies want to get involved in those domestic markets there. So I include KFC because the book uses this example that there's over 2,000 KFCs popping up all around China, having a great time with it in terms of economic success and business booming there in China for KFC. And likewise, Asian car companies want to get involved in our markets, that they want to compete with the American car manufacturers. And so this push and pull in terms of economics in global trade does have advantages for both areas of the world. Now, the call centers. IT jobs have been shipped overseas since 2003, 300,000 IT jobs by 2003, and it's an estimated 3.3 million more from 2003 to 2020. And that'll be the focus of a movie that we'll probably check out later this semester, Outsourced. Which leaves us to the Great Recession. Now, the Great Recession comes with the housing bubble. And there were market adjustments in the housing industry, as well as some subprime lending. And what happened there was that banks were allowing folks to take out mortgages on houses that they likely could not afford to keep up with. And so these combination of factors just caused a bust in the housing and construction industries here in the United States and Canada, and this part of this global recession that was taking place, and it just totally crashed the American economy at this point. From September of 08 to March of 09, American stock market, U.S. stock exchange, was cut in half in terms of its holdings, and so unfortunately what this did was it exacerbated the income inequality in the United States, and specifically in the United States, where we see now that the top 1% own 40% of the nation's wealth, and the bottom 80% owning just 7%. And so this is a major problem in American politics and a major problem in American economics for the American people. As we talked about in our introduction, we want to measure the well-being of a population, and this certainly does not bode well that Americans are facing this rapidly increasing levels of income inequality. So no good. Now, food production in the United States was the old-fashioned family farms, which quickly moved to agribusiness, which is this large-scale factory farming. And this goes hand in hand with genetically modified foods. And so there's a pushback now on these large-scale operations and use of genetically modified crops to move towards organically grown, locally sourced food as the science emerges, and we know the health effects of a locally sourced food, and sort of the health effects and the ecological health effects of the local environment as well. Now, it's likely that market forces will dictate this in both the United States and Canada. We brought to power in politics, and that of the United States, and the role of money in U.S. politics. The book does focus on this. It talks about political disillusionment and how some people are frustrated with the role of money in U.S. elections, and so they therefore just stay home. Perhaps that's part of it, but the turnout in 2016 presidential election was 60% of that of that can vote, and it was up from 2012, but down from 2008 by the numbers that we have at this point. Numbers are just a little bit higher in Canada, and however, the book continues to go on that public policy tends to favor the economic elites in this country rather than lower income people. And again, this ties into this theme in the book of this talk about political disillusionment and people just simply being unhappy with the system and therefore opting to not participate. Now, the influence of debt on U.S. politics, there's relatively two schools of thought on this issue, where the Democrats in this country, the left-leaning party in this country, tend to focus, in terms of tackling the debt, tend to focus more on cutting military spending and increasing taxes on the wealthy or corporations, whereas in terms of tackling the debt of the Republican Party in this country or the right-leaning party in this country tend to focus cuts towards social safety nets such as health care and education and other social programs like Social Security. Now, the influence of the United States and Canada around the world, it is no doubt that the United States plays a direct and heavy role around the world. We have a reputation of being the global police. We have certainly found our way into many conflicts, many regions around the world for our interests and perhaps in the pursuit of democracy, or so some will tell us. But that is being changed. Other countries are now pushing back in terms of their ability to have some clout on the global stage. And we call these countries BRICS. Now, these are countries that are emerging economies, that are increasingly large militaries, and an increasingly large pool in the world just due to their population and a variety of other factors. And these BRICS are called Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and they are challenging that absolute power where the United States was situating itself just certainly on its own. Now, the United States, more heavy in the world in terms of its influence than Canada. Canada's probably largest claim to fame in terms of its geopolitics, like the book says, is its ability to influence its friend, the United States. The relationship between the United States and Canada are complicated because we do share very similar features in terms of our economics, our political structures, our people's history and culture are very similar. But at the same time, there just isn't that same pursuit around the world for wars and globalization and development that you would see like the pursuits of that in the United States. For instance, the Quiet Revolution that was occurring in Quebec, in Canada, largely they wanted autonomy for foreign policy perspective, one of the provinces in Canada, because they were against Canada's support for the United States in our wars in the Middle East. And so this does cause certain problems, but largely the United States and Canada are friends in most circumstances. Justin Trudeau and President Obama were largely seen to have a bromance going on. Things have changed. Did not want to take that handshake here by this picture, eventually did, so spoiler alert. But what you're seeing now is that because there are left-leaning politicians still remaining in office, and ours being term limited, and now bringing in the Trump administration, you're seeing that the Canadians' attempt of a trajectory toward a more progressive agenda, where the United States is going backwards in terms of its progressive agenda. And so you see these two being at odds with each other in terms of their visions for the region, and so we perhaps might be on a break right now. Now, social safety net. This is sort of where the United States and Canada differ most drastically, or at least one of the bigger areas where we can differentiate ourselves. And social safety nets are the services provided by the government, unemployment and welfare and healthcare and things like that. Healthcare in the sense of Canada, not so much for the United States in terms of our healthcare, stems from the Bismarck model, where it's tied to our employers first and foremost, whereas Canada offers a government-run healthcare system on 100% covered. Now, in the United States, trickle-down economics is the prevailing political argument against spending more money on social assistance or support. Now, trickle-down economics, to explain, is quite a simple concept, if you will. It is that you give breaks to the wealthy and large corporations in this country, and then that money is to literally trickle down into the hands of the middle class and the low-income people in terms of job creation and higher wages. Numbers have shown that this perhaps is not the case, although not to get too political on one side or the other to indoctrinate you or to tell you what to think. But the other end of that argument would be just give the money to the people who need it. So if it is the poor, in fact, who do need social assistance, perhaps just give that money to the poor directly through these safety nets and forget the breaks to the well-off. And you can make up your own mind of which way you see fit. However, that is a stark difference between the United States and Canada and those approaches. Like I mentioned, the United States healthcare system differs greatly that of Canada. Drugs in the United States, we're facing an opioid epidemic at this moment. We are the world's largest importer of illegal drugs, but that's a whole different matter. In terms of our opioid epidemic, it's rapidly increasing. Business Insider believes that now 183,000 people have died since the turn of the century because of this, and opioids being prescription and non-prescription painkillers that's rapidly taking on the United States. It really has no geographic boundary at this point. Typically, drug use is higher in poor and marginalized communities, and that typically is the case, and that is the case in this sense, but it's pushed largely beyond class and geographic boundaries here in the sense of the opioid epidemic, which is why it's certainly getting attention based on who the lives have been claimed. And that brings us to how has our response been? And typically with drug crimes in this country, you'd see lower income people targeted with jail sentences, and maybe perhaps wealthier people in this country are seen to be sent to rehab or some sort of rehabilitation. And therefore there is this perhaps a racialized or some sort of divide between economics and class of how drug punishment has taken place inside the United States. Now recently there's been a founded war on marijuana by that guy right there, Attorney General of the United States and former U.S. Senator from Alabama, Jeff Sessions, part of the Trump administration, where the United States, federally speaking, marijuana is illegal in the United States from a federal standpoint, from a country standpoint. Now, several states have taken measures to legalize that for recreational or medical use. And what happened in 2013 was a Cole memo in the Obama administration, named after Deputy Attorney General, was that the federal government would not interfere in those areas where it's been legalized by the states. This gentleman here, Attorney General, wants to sort of reverse course on that, and so there is this conflict right now between states and the federal government regarding marijuana. And needless to say, we do have a problem with illegal drug use in the United States in terms of our importation of that. It has caused a drug war with the global south, with places like Colombia and Mexico and other places that we've imported from. We've launched drug wars there. And we have a problem with opioid epidemic at this moment, and it'll be interesting to see how the situation continues to become politicized and how it's dealt with. But the Trump administration did declare a public health emergency, as well as many local communities have already done so. Now it brings us to urbanization. Urban sprawl, which has grown since the end of World War II, and again, urban sprawl is just that growing from the inner city, that city core, and growing outward and an expansion. Now that's grown, that has subsided since in recent years, but it's grown since World War II, subsided only recently because city centers have begun to be redeveloped to become more livable areas, more lucrative to stick around. And this is largely surrounded by ideas like smart growth, which is planning to create areas where one can live locally. There's environmental benefits in mind, but these ideas of walkable areas to bars and restaurants and your employer, a bikeable area, is supposed to be far more enticing than an area where you have to have a daily commute of an hour in your car, or these other ideas like that. And a city, smart growth and living in the city does have a lot of advantages, where you have a usually improved healthcare accessibility, you have improved school districts, improved safety, and other measures. So there are a lot of benefits to this sort of smart growth idea. Now brownfields, like that old steel mill that I shared with you, that are old industrial sites that are decrepit, degraded conditions, and there are obstacles to redevelopment because sometimes there's toxic residue in these areas that it's difficult for them to be just simply knocked down and to start anew. So those are just one sort of barrier to smart growth and livability in the redevelopment of the inner city. Now the inner city home to housing segregation and gentrification. My Shameless fans out there should know what gentrification is because it's featured in that show in the later seasons. But the renovation of old urban districts by affluent investors, sort of the wealthy, which is a process that usually displaces poorer residents. And so there's local examples of this taking place in Tallahassee and many other urban areas around the country where it's driving out poor people for the sake of middle income or high income development. Now, aging in North America, there's an increasing life expectancy and lower fertility rates that have created an aging population. Now, the opioid epidemic has had such a profound impact on the country that the last 2 years in a row now, our life expectancy has actually decreased. And that's attributed to the opioid epidemic, although there's also a narrative out there that it's just simply not only the case. But generally, increasing life expectancy in this country and lower fertility rates and less children being born has created an older population, because I talked about baby boomers, that generation born between 1946 and 1964, 70 plus million Americans that are beginning to retire. They love the Beatles, but who doesn't? And so that we're going to have to focus more and more as a country on Social Security in the United States and retirement. And to get a little bit technical, but there's this idea of the 1983 amendments where it gradually increased the retirement age in this country from 65 to 67 with an 11-year period on 66, where this idea where benefits from Social Security, something that you pay into as a safety net, and then having somewhat of an income once you retire from your employer. There's this debate to continue to increase the retirement age in this country in order to protect the money that is within Social Security as more and more people use the system. There's a larger toll taken on the fund, and there's a whole other lot of complicated factors that go into Social Security as money borrowed from it and things along that line. But broadly speaking, that Social Security is facing issues in this country, and baby boomers are using it because they're beginning to retire. If you click on the link, it talks a little bit more about baby boomers, their importance in this country. Now, population change and distribution in this country. I include this electoral college map not to rile us all up with politics, but to help illustrate where people are and where they're moving to. The electoral college in this country is what elects the President of the United States. We vote in a popular vote. However, then those states cast the number of ballots that they have, which is determined by their representatives and the general population of each state. And that's the reason why I bring it up. Places like the old economic core are losing votes in the electoral college, and places like the American Southwest and others, even parts of the American Southeast, are gaining votes in the electoral college. And that's important because that's where the people are moving, and those areas are becoming more and more influential in presidential elections. Sociocultural issues, immigration and diversity. Immigration has been the source of nearly all North Americans as we know it today, absent of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada and Native Americans in the United States. The book does have a discussion on immigrants in the United States. Do they pay taxes? Do they take American jobs? What are they doing? And I think it does a good job of sort of answering those questions for you. And it states, the immigrants are usually they're paying their taxes inadvertently, property taxes through rent, so not direct paying property taxes. Some, of course, do, but a large amount are paying through rent, a large amount also paying directly through property taxes, paying sales taxes and payroll taxes. They're largely not tapping into some of those social safety nets, and they have actually a lesser burden on the health infrastructure because of an idea of the Latino paradox, where folks immigrating from Latino countries actually have higher quality of health than people native to the United States. And so that brings us to the sort of the lower wage jobs, where most immigrants are occupying those low wage jobs, which usually Americans are not competing for. However, as immigration continues to evolve in this country, immigrants and Americans continue to compete for nearly all jobs, which brings us to a sort of a large debate that's happening right now, DACA and the DREAM Act bill. And what we'd want to say about this is DACA was an executive order, deferred action for childhood arrivals, signed by President Obama because we could not get the DREAM Act bill passed in the United States. And so as a result, he put forward these protections for those arriving at a young age in this country, that they would have some legal protections. And the DREAM Act bill is not new. It actually, Dick Durbin and Orrin Hatch, the United States senators, tried to come forward with this in 2001, and it failed. And 2009, 10, 11, 12, failed. And so the path to citizenship, or the path to legal status, is continually debated in this country. We call these people that are trying to get protections under this DREAM Act bill or DACA as dreamers. We know there's approximately 800,000 of them in this country, and it's going to have immense consequences of how this situation is handled. However, the United States Congress and the President, however it's handled, whether the right way, the wrong way, and you could be the judge of what you feel is the right or wrong way. But one way or the other of how this is handled, it certainly will have a profound impact on American politics and the American economy. Now, the book states a culture of poverty in this country. All ethnic backgrounds are vulnerable to poverty in the United States. However, especially minorities, as they are more vulnerable in this country to more than just poverty, but also to environmental issues and others, just based on their geographic location. And that depends on scale. However, we talk about minimum wage in this country at $7.25 an hour. I was doing some research on this, and I found that in 1968, minimum wage peaked in this country, which would be about $11 an hour in today's dollars, and it certainly wasn't $11. And as minimum wage has gone up, every time minimum wages change, it's gone up. But in those dollars back then, 1968, it would have been like $11 in our money today. And so if it would have kept up with productivity, it would be $19.33 today. However, it certainly did not keep up, and so there's a case that this wage remains the same, which does keep folks in poverty. Medicaid is a social safety net for those who are unable to have affordable health insurance, to have health insurance otherwise, and so this is continually attacked for potential cuts, and also again an issue that's quite ripe to talk about would be CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program, which expired in over the last year, and it's not yet been renewed. And this is for children, and it was expanded to pregnant mothers a few years back. And so if this is not renewed, this is what people that are sort of don't have adequate health insurance but are too poor for other government assistance. So this is this sort of people that were falling in between the cracks, that was addressed first in 1993 from the Bill Clinton administration, pushed by then First Lady Hillary Clinton, and so it's gone from there. Now again, these critiques of some of these things, some of these cuts, is that we've seen since 2010, 79 rural hospitals have closed throughout the United States. And so we want to talk about the potential consequences of cuts and freezes to these types of programs, and what they'll have on our impact and our health and our well-being of that of a country. Now, religion in this country is made, and in Canada, is largely Christian nations. The United States and Canada are approximately 70% Christian. We could talk about the geography of Christian subgroups as seen here, largely Southern Baptist in southeastern United States, the Church of Latter-day Saints in the American West, and those folks are Mormon. And we'll talk about the Catholic Church, which is sort of just the other sort of major, we have Lutherans up in this area, and that's largely because of how they were settled from Europe, bringing that religion over from Northern and Western Europe. And then Catholicism, because of the immigrants that have come there in the Northeast, largely from countries like Ireland and Italy, and obviously the American South with New Wave migrants coming from Latin America, largely Catholic countries. And these relationships between religion and politics do influence it in terms of where areas are more conservative or liberal in terms of their political affiliations based on their religion. That wraps up part 2 on North America.